to be presenting my paper, We Are All Terrorists, Working on X and Network Spaces. And I will start things off with just a personal story / script. Faden, terrorist enters the customs line, acts inconspicuous so as not to attract attention. Customs agent. Sir, you cannot be on your phone in this line. Fear enters the terrorist's mind, followed by relief when he realizes the agent is addressing the Asian man in front of him. Ensures his passport and boarding pass are on display, fully visible. Wants to appear not just compliant, but eager to be compliant with U.S. Customs. Scans his boarding pass at one of several stations. Enters a second one. Anxiety grows. Should I have gone clean-shaven today? Should I have cut my hair shorter? He's next in line. He's called. Wastes no time arriving at the border agent station. Border agent. Where are you heading, sir? Terrorist. To Portland, Oregon, with a stopover in Chicago. He's thinking, don't show hesitation. Don't sound too scripted, though. Border agent. For what purpose? Terrorist. An academic conference. Presents his conference schedule with his name as a presenter to provide evidence. Do I appear too prepared? He wonders. Border agent. Runs the passport through the system. Stands up, walks out of the booth with passport. Come with me, sir. Terrorist looks defeated. Chest tightens, shoulders rise. Follows somberly, but without hesitation, for fear of displaying a lack of willingness. Border agent enters the customs detention area. Turns to the terrorist. Have a seat. Agent opens the windowless door and walks inside while the terrorist sits down in the detention area. Bare walls, save for the U.S. Customs official seal, a no cell phone sign, and a television turned to CNN spewing news about Gaza bombs, Ferguson riots, and ISIS. The terrorist looks across the room. His gaze meets another's. Another terrorist, a black terrorist. Their eyes meet. He looks to his left. Another terrorist, Arabic. He looks down at his mixed skin, a failed attempt to pass. He looks up at his comrades. He sees himself. What does he see? Not anxiousness, worriedness, not necessarily anger, perhaps not fear. He sees hopelessness, defeat, numbness, and acceptance of state-sanctioned terror on the terrorist himself, the internalization of white terror. He leans back in his chair, squeezes the handle of his carry-on, glances over at each of his comrades once more, and whispers in the slightest of ways, "We are all terrorists." Fade out. So this paper explores the effective experiences of liminal terrorist bodies in airport spaces through a reimagining of these experiences as scripted performances. Why scripts? Scripts require the regulation and coercion of bodies in the construction of performances for certain audiences. Scripts also have settings, which are crucial in the activation of emotions, memories, and affects. Within this paper is the airport in particular, which functions as the stage in which terrorist actors are reminded and reprimanded for the performances they play in this setting. The post-9/11 era of heightened border security makes airports ripe with affective memories that continuously haunt us, though in different ways, about the ramifications of September 11th. The airport, however, also represents a liminal space where certain individuals exist in a space of in-betweenness. The in-betweenness of airports is heightened from the moment we move past security until we pass security at our destination. If this is true, then we exist in between time and space while waiting for our flights, without our luggage that has been checked in. When we board the plane and on the flight, our existence is temporally suspended in this place. The liminality of airports is useful because it captures the liminality of terrorist bodies, which exist as outsiders of the West through their construction as terrorists, but also as outsiders of the terrorists they simultaneously perform and yet never become. The affect of this diaspora is most pronounced for the terrorist body at airports, where they are continuously reminded of the scripted role they play in the West post-9/11 imaginary. With this in mind, I ask, how do we consider the effective experiences of Middle Eastern bodies in domestic border spaces in an era of securitization, digital marking, and racialized surveillance? I explore this question utilizing Sarah Ahmed, Judith Butler, Dina Georgis, and W.E.B. Dubois to illuminate what it means, or rather how it feels to be feared. Throughout this paper, I argue that the conceptualization of these experiences through scripts and settings help us understand how what I term an effective ambivalence haunts liminal terrorist bodies within these spaces, these bodies whose homes are both lost and losable in the post-9/11 Western imaginary. So before moving further, I must identify how I'm using the terms we and terrorist. I'm utilizing the term terrorist to describe the tagging of post-colonial Middle Eastern bodies that reside in the West. Ahmed argues that emotions are not located in a single body or object, and this allows emotions to reproduce those same effects consistently. In her conception of affective economies of hate, the terrorsphere object is not located within a single body, but instead moves between and through bodies and accumulates over time. This accumulation mobilizes fear and hate towards terrorist bodies, allowing for the expansion of white American bodies in defense against the Islamic terrorist figure, embodied within Middle Eastern bodies who are contained, policed, and discriminated against through this deployment of affect. Furthermore, the term we is utilized in multiple ways to describe the effective spectacle of the liminal terrorist body. Rana tells us that the westernized idea of the racialized Muslim has involved the conflation of multiple populations and geographies into an area of threat known as the Middle East, which extends from North Africa to South Asia. The bodies that occupy these spaces are constructed by Western discourse as visible racial threats, the villains in the war on terror, the objects that serve to, as Ahmed describes, mobilize the collective body of white America in union against those objects. Within the body of this paper, then, I am conceptualizing we and terrorists as the non-white bodies that physically reside in the West, and in many cases are citizens of the West, which are systematically targeted for state violence and discrimination because of their collapsibility into the terrorist object of fear. Through Butler's conceptualization in her Frames of War, I encourage us to explore how terrorist bodies are captured through framing within the airport setting. Just as terrorist scripts are appropriated and regulated, terrorist bodies are literally captured by frames in the airport. Security cameras frame, capture, and survey us as we go through the airport. Border passport machines snap our photos and we make our way through customs. Instructions guide us through not only how to fit into the frame of the camera, but how to look or perform for the camera. Is it no surprise then that we are asked not to smile, but rather to present a neutral face to be captured? Being asked to deaden our emotions, our humanity, through the act of being captured by camera frames inherently links us to the hundreds of real, ungrievable terrorist specters that haunt us in daily media reports. Just as Ahmed's description of the mobility of terrorist objects in and through bodies, the faces of those bodies and ours are just as easily interchangeable through these frames of terror. Moreover, the capturing of the terrorist in the frames of the airport customs cameras stands as a supremely effective moment. As these captured terrorist faces, we are asked to be emotionless for the capture while simultaneously experiencing feelings of anxiety, shame, and dread at the possibility of physical capture and detainment. The fetishization of this particular facial capture of Middle Eastern bodies occludes the production of the frames, made possible through modern discourses of Orientalism and colonial logic that encloses us as terrorist objects of fear. It is, as Butler states, crucial to then look beyond the frames to understand these broader underlying processes that create the frames in the first place, as well as to identify the humanity and grievability of these individuals, something which exceeds these frames. So in my description of scripts and frames that accentuate the experience of airport spaces for terrorist bodies, the analysis has been focused on the liminal space, this in-betweenness that profoundly shapes the affective experiences of domestic terrorist bodies. We need to explore, however, the ways in which the two sides of the space are resolved for the terrorist bodies themselves who reside in the West. To analyze this, I will utilize W.E. Du Bois' concept of double consciousness. His narrative on the reconciliation of two warring ideals in one dark body is pertinent within the liminal terrorist populations and individuals in the West. The double consciousness of the terrorist citizen is reproduced through script making as we are removed from ourselves through performances that are required for our existence. However, this shift of double consciousness to the terrorist citizen involves an active reconciling both the internal citizen and the terrorist self in order to exist. To answer the question, how does it feel to be a problem that Du Bois poses, I begin by exploring how we internalize the part of us that is problematic, the frame picture we cannot break, the script we cannot rewrite. To look at our terrorist selves through the eyes of others is to look at the terrorist self through the citizen self's eyes. In this respect, our citizen self is asked to take part in this effective economy of hate, to understand that this frame is a necessary unfreedom for our freedom, that we and many others need protection from ourselves. If we accept this role to play as a citizen, then we can better resolve state-sanctioned surveillance, detainment, and demonization of our terrorist selves. We resolve this violence through the false belief that our willingness to voluntarily take part in this somehow distances us from the terrorist self and will construct us as less of a stranger. Unfortunately, attempts to rid the problematic terrorist self through the performance, in actuality, simply strengthens the frame imprisoning us. So within these two competing ideals, we might also conceptualize competing effective economies as well. If our citizen self might be shaped through effective economies of hate, our terrorist self, or rather the self that is shaped through its construction as a terrorist, accumulates grief, hopelessness, and anger. Perhaps these competing affects provide a better answer to the question, how does it feel to be a problem? This peculiarity of precariousness, the strangeness of being readily collapsible into a terrorist object of fear, produces an affective ambivalence in the self and is deployed in many different ways. This affective ambivalence reaches its pinnacle in the airport space, where collapsibility is imminent and where we see ourselves through the eyes of others the most. The deployment of affective ambivalence is difficult to frame or script, as it perhaps exists outside these pictures and roles, and is instead embedded within us as a result of our double consciousness. I pose whether recognition of this ambivalence within the terrorist object of fear can be a point of exploration, or that the recognition itself is productive to better understanding how we exist as liminal bodies always in unfamiliar spaces. So I've demonstrated the affective experience of liminal terrorist bodies in the West through the use of scripting and framing within the airport space. Through these conceptions, we can better understand the processes by which state-sanctioned violence on Middle Eastern bodies residing in the West is resolved within these individuals. I would like to conclude by looking to Dina Georgis, who offers a reconceptualization of grief that remobilizes affect within the Middle Eastern terrorist, and offering a theory of representation that foregrounds human emotion and a psychoanalytic model. She turns to the aesthetic as an avenue for representing post-colonial subjectivities that center upon racial suffering. Importantly, she poses the question, how do we humanely, ethically, lovingly represent terrorist subjectivity? Through Fanon, Georgis suggests a new humanism that aspires to, one, understand terrorist acts as a symbolization of the affect of difficult experience, and two, suggests decolonization as a psychic strategy to restore the humanity of race subjects. In Georgis, we find a deployment of affect that, rather than objectifies the terrorist other, explores the very affective ambivalences of Middle Eastern subjects in relation to psychic racial suffering. I wish to extend her concept of the ambivalent terrorist to diasporic subjects in the West. We terrorize in our affective production of fear through symbolism of violence rather than any actual physical form of violence itself. If, according to Georgis, terrorism is itself a post-colonial tragedy that sparks an affective response of grief to racialized injuries suffered through years of Western occupation and violence, then those of us terrorists who reside in the West may play out this tragedy in the stage of the airport. Our liminal existence allows us to act on the strips attached to us, but also persuades us to grieve for and with the terrorist bodies we represent in the Middle East. This grieving is a product of liminalness, for many of us do not understand necessarily the experience of colonialism beyond our own borders in which we reside, but also do not belong. We can, however, not only grieve for the collapse of our bodies into the terrorist object of fear, but also grieve for the grief caused by, as Georgie states, the devastating life conditions that politically contextualizes terrorism is the only viable means of resistance. Such an analysis represents a process of rehumanizing diasporic and foreign terrorist bodies. I put forth then a rewriting of better scripts, which builds upon Georges' call for better stories, in which he conceptualizes as the principle of how people collectively share a story in order to survive better. Rather than championing resistance, which Georges believes cannot adequately recognize the tragedy of terrorism, she instead argues for stories that stage dilemmas and problems which emerge from how we are dependent on one another. I believe that it is the transition from stories to scripts that we can recognize what is lost in the transition and why it becomes losable. That is, we can account for and take up the sites of loss and injury that became lost in the scripts we perform. How can we then reinsert these affected injuries back into the scripts? Moreover, can we, instead of telling better stories, play out better scripts in the airport space? Rewriting and acting out the better script, rather than being deduced to a form of resistance that Georgie's cautions against, provides the opportunity to better understand this affective ambivalence shaped by our double consciousness, and also calls into question the frames, the processes by which the frames captures us in such violent ways. I'm interested in further exploring the aesthetic as it can be imagined in the performance of better scripts in airport spaces as a form of activism, in the hopes that such acts can disrupt a post 9/11 era of securitization and surveillance, an era concretized on the blood and bodies of Middle Eastern subjects. A return to the liminal space of the airport, the terrorist ground zero, might allow for practices of solidarity between diasporic subjects in the West and those terrorist spectres of fear in the Middle East, whom we represent and perform through an enlivening of these lost effective scripts of racialized injury. Thank you.